Let's drill further down now into some of the big problems in macroeconomics in our next two modules. Then we will look at the various policy tools that macroeconomists may use to address them. Inflation is defined as an upward movement of prices from one year to the next. It is typically measured by the percentage change in price indices, such as the Consumer Price Index, the Producer Price Index, or the so-called GDP deflator. For example, the Producer Price Index is based on a number of important raw materials, while the most widely used measure of inflation, the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, is calculated by pricing a market basket of goods and services purchased by a typical household. This market basket for the CPI includes the prices of food, clothing, shelter, fuel, transportation, medical care, college tuition, and other goods and services purchased for day-to-day living. Inflation has often been described as the cruelest tax because it eats away at our savings and at our paychecks. For example, what do you think happens if the rate of inflation exceeds the rate of growth in your paycheck? Well, that means your real income or purchasing power is declining, even though your wages are going up. And that's a cruel tax indeed. While inflation may be the cruelest tax because it eats away at our wealth and purchasing power, macroeconomics can be equally cruel when a recession results in the actual loss of your job. As a key definition, the unemployment rate is measured as the number of unemployed persons divided by the number of people in the labor force. And in large economies like that of China, Europe, Japan, and the United States, the typical unemployment rate during a healthy economic expansion will likely be in the low single digits, somewhere between 3% and 6%. However, during a severe recession, that unemployment rate can climb well into the double digits, while specific groups like youth and disadvantaged minorities can see rates of 30% or higher. The rate of economic growth is typically measured by the growth in the nation's real inflation-adjusted gross domestic product, or real GDP. Typically, developed economies like that of Canada, Europe, and the United States will average GDP growth rates in the low single digits at full employment, while developing economies like that of China and India will have rates slightly to somewhat higher. As for how gross domestic product, or GDP, is defined, it is the market value of all the final goods and services produced in a country in a given year. And as a practical matter, economists have two ways of making this gross domestic product calculation: the income approach and the expenditures approach. With the income approach, also called flow of cost, GDP is calculated by adding up all the income people receive each year from producing that year's output. Under this approach, the gross domestic product roughly equals wages earned by workers plus rents earned by property owners plus interest received by lenders plus profits earned by firms. In contrast with the expenditures approach, also called flow of product, the gross domestic product equals consumption plus business investment plus government expenditures plus so-called net exports, where net exports are defined as the difference between total exports and total imports. This, in fact, is the basic Keynesian equation in macroeconomics, named after the famous British economist John Maynard Keynes. In this course, we will make great use of this expenditures approach formulation when it comes to learning how to forecast the economy, and we will refer to it hereinafter in shorthand form as the GDP equation or GDP forecasting model. So let's pause the presentation now a moment as you study this equation carefully and commit it to memory. And in a subsequent lesson, I will show you in great detail how to use this GDP equation to conduct your own economic forecasts, as every business executive and money manager should learn to do. In thinking about economic growth, it is also useful to distinguish between actual and potential gross domestic product. Actual GDP represents what a nation is currently producing, while potential GDP represents the maximum amount the economy can produce without causing inflation. When actual GDP is well below potential GDP, we are in the recessionary range of the economy. In contrast, when actual GDP is above potential GDP, we run the strong risk of a type of inflation called demand pull inflation, the case where the aggregate demand in the economy is outpacing aggregate supply, causing prices to rise. This figure illustrates the relationship between actual and potential GDP and the unemployment rate. In the top portion of the figure, the difference between potential GDP and actual GDP is known as the GDP gap. This GDP recessionary gap measures the output the economy sacrifices when it fails to fully use its productive potential. Note in the lower figure that a larger recessionary gap means a higher unemployment rate, and vice versa. Take a minute now to study this figure carefully and get firmly in your mind the idea of actual versus potential GDP. And note the clear relationship between recessionary gaps and the unemployment rate. In thinking about economic growth and the gross domestic product, it is also useful to distinguish between nominal GDP and real GDP. Nominal gross domestic product is measured in actual market prices. However, prices change over time, often rapidly, and if we were to use nominal GDP to measure economic growth, it would give us a distorted picture of actual growth. For example, if prices double, nominal GDP doubles. That doesn't necessarily mean any actual growth occurred. The apparent growth in nominal GDP could just be due to inflation. To address this yardstick problem, macroeconomists use real inflation-adjusted GDP when tracking things like the business cycle and measuring actual economic growth. Real GDP is simply nominal GDP adjusted for inflation, and it is calculated in constant prices for a particular benchmark year. Moreover, when we divide nominal GDP by real GDP, we obtain the GDP deflator, another valuable inflation index. Now here's a key point. Real inflation-adjusted gross domestic product is the best widely available measure of the level and growth of output in the economy. In addition, the movements of real GDP serve as the carefully monitored pulse of a nation's economy. For example, a falling rate of real GDP growth in a quarter may signal a recession will soon arrive. As we shall see in our discussions of economic forecasting, it is precisely these movements in real GDP that help us chart and follow corresponding movements in the business cycle, a key element of the strategic landscape for businesses. For now, let's take a break before moving on in the next module to a discussion of two additional macroeconomic issues of great significance: budget deficits and trade imbalances.